All right, guys, welcome to this first ever episode of Insider Insights. In this new series, I'm going to be interviewing a wide range of experts, having awesome conversations and sharing their insights with you. In this first episode, we are having a conversation with Gretchen Rubin. Gretchen Rubin is a multiple New York Times bestselling author, including books like Better Than Before, The Happiness Project, and Four Tendencies, which is going to be the focus of our conversation. She also has a weekly podcast called Happier with Gretchen Rubin, where she discusses happiness and habits with her sister. Maybe something you guys are interested in. Now, in this conversation, we're going to focus on the Four Tendencies personality model and how it relates to students and how you can use this to be more effective in your student life, whether that's academics or in your personal life as well. So without further ado, enjoy this conversation with Gretchen Rubin. All right, Gretchen, thanks so much for joining us here. So to begin, can you explain the Four Tendencies model for those who aren't already familiar?
Yeah, so with the Four Tendencies is a personality framework that looks at a very narrow but very significant aspect of your nature. And what it looks at is how you respond to expectations. And we all face two kinds of expectations. Outer expectations, which is like a deadline from a professor or request from a friend. And then we also face inner expectations, my own desire to get back into meditation, my own desire to keep a New Year's resolution. And depending on how we respond to outer and inner expectations, that's what makes us an upholder, a questioner, an obliger, or a rebel. And this sounds kind of dry, but it ends up being really juicy when you think it through and understand how it can make your life easier and make it easier to work with other people. So the first, upholders readily meet outer and inner expectations. So they meet the work deadline, they keep the request, they keep the New Year's resolution without much fuss. They want to know what other people expect from them, but their expectations for themselves are just as important. So their motto is, discipline is my freedom. Then there are questioners. Questioners question all expectations. They'll do something if they think it makes sense. So they resist anything irrational, arbitrary, unjustified. They always need to know why. Once they've decided that something meets their inner expectation and makes good sense to them, they will do it no problem. But if it fails their inner expectations, then they will resist. So their motto is, I will comply if you convince me why. Then there are obligers. Obligers readily meet outer expectations, but they struggle to meet inner expectations. I got my first insight into this tendency when a friend said to me, I don't understand it. I want to exercise. And when I was in high school, I was on the track team and I never missed track practice. So why can't I go running now? Well, it turns out that when she had a team and a coach expecting her to show up, no problem. But now that she's trying to go on her own, it's a struggle. So the key thing for obligers to remember is that if they want to meet an inner expectation, they must have a form of outer accountability. If an obliger wants to read a book, join a book group. That's how it works for obligers. So their motto is, you can count on me, and I'm counting on you to count on me. And then the final tendency is rebel. And rebels resist all expectations, outer and inner alike. They can do anything they want to do. They can do anything they choose to do. But if you ask or tell them to do something, they are very likely to resist. And typically, they don't like to tell themselves what to do. So they don't sign up for a 10 a.m. spin class on Saturday because they're like, I don't know what I'm going to want to do on Saturday. And just the idea that people are expecting me to show up is going to annoy me. They put a very high value on spontaneity, kind of doing things their own way in their own time. So their motto is, you can't make me, and neither can I. And the thing about the tendencies is there's not the equal number of tendencies. For both men and women, the biggest tendency is obliger. So if you're thinking about yourself or if you're thinking about managing other people, you want to think, okay, there's going to be a lot of obligers. You either are an obliger or you have many obligers in your life. The smallest tendency is rebel. And then my tendency is only slightly larger. I'm an upholder. Those are kind of the two extreme personality types. Those are smaller. So that is, most people know what they are. From that, I can do Game of Thrones characters. I can do Parks and Rec characters. They're very obvious once you know them. There is a quiz at quiz.gretchenrubin.com that will spit out an answer if you want to take a quiz that will tell you and give you a little report. But a lot of people know what they are just from that really short description.
Yeah, when I first heard the description, I instantly knew that I was a questioner. The way I was introduced to the Four Tendencies model is a girl I was dating while I was in residency brought it up, and she's an obliger, and she's like, "Oh, you're totally a questioner. You should take this quiz. You should read this book," and it helped us kind of understand each other. And what I really found fascinating is that it's way more simple than any other like personality test, because it's focusing on inner and outer expectations, and it not only helped me understand other people, but also understand myself. Like, oh, that's why I'm doing these things.
Yes.
But I recently took the quiz again, and this time when I took it, I got upholder. So is that something that changes with time?
It doesn't change with time. And part of the problem with any quiz is that you can kind of answer it with something in your mind. And so I would always say, trust your own judgment. If another tendency is just ringing more true for you, then really that's something worth thinking about, or what other people tell you, because they probably kind of see you more clearly in some ways than you see yourself. And of course, there is a lot of upholders and questioners overlap. They both respond to inner expectations. There's a lot of common ground with questioners and upholders, and so you might be a questioner who tips to upholder. Also, I will say about questioners, one of the things about questioners is whenever people say to me, "Well, I'm a little bit of everything," that's a very strong sign that you're a questioner, because questioners are like, "Well, I do what makes sense in the moment. Why am I doing it? Because it makes sense." Well, they're like, the fact that they're saying, "Why would I?" is very questioner. And so maybe a questioner is also kind of more likely to be like, "Well, I can sort of see the upholder view." And then also kind of once you know the quiz too, I think sometimes people then change their answers subconsciously too. Once you know it, it's kind of, maybe it's a little bit clouded by what you know. But there is a deep, really, I'm an upholder who tips to questioner. My husband's a questioner who tips to upholder. There's a big overlap between questioners and upholders.
Interesting. Speaking of this, like you're saying a questioner that tips towards upholder, there seems to be these variations, these like the primary and the secondary.
Yes.
Can you explain how that works?
Yeah, so if you envision the tendencies as a Venn diagram of four overlapping circles in a diamond shape, what that would make clear to you is that each of the tendencies overlaps with two other tendencies. Those are sort of your wing tendencies, which I think is like horoscope language. So you're a questioner. So if you're a questioner, you also overlap with upholders, because both questioners and upholders respond to inner expectations. The questioners also overlap with rebels because they resist outer expectations. So you can be a questioner who tips to upholder, which is like what my husband is, or you could be a questioner who tips to rebel. That's like Steve Jobs. Deeply, he's a questioner, but there's a really strong element of resistance. It's really hard to convince him to do something that you want or ask him to do, because he's like, "Well, why should I? Why should I? Why should I?" Whereas questioners who tip to upholders tend to be more accepting of like rules. Like some questioners, and I know this sounds funny, maybe you're like this, some questioners have a lot of trouble with, say, traffic regulations, because to them it's like it's arbitrary that it just applies to everybody. Like, why is everybody driving 65 miles an hour? I'm a great driver, you're a terrible driver. Like, that's just arbitrary. Whereas like a questioner who tips to upholder tends to be like, "Okay, 3 garments to a dressing room, I get it." Whereas other questioners are like, "Oh my gosh, this is just like making me crazy because it makes no sense." So, and then like I'm an upholder. Some upholders tip to questioner, that's what I am. But then some upholders tip to obliger, because like obligers, we both respond to outer expectations. And those upholders kind of feel more the weight of others' expectations. I have to say, I'm pretty free from the weight of others' expectations in a way that can make me seem pretty cold and probably kind of rude sometimes. That's kind of upholdery. Upholders who tip to obliger are less like that, because they have that responsiveness to outer expectations is kind of more in an element in their nature.
Okay, so then if someone is a questioner, for example, they're likely going to be either the upholder as like their you said their wing, or what was the term?
Right, they tip to it. It's sort of it's like their secondary is a good way to think of it. Yeah.
So either upholder or rebel, but they can't be both, because I can see elements of both in myself, where I'm like, "Oh, someone told me not to start a YouTube channel. I want to start a YouTube channel more."
Right. Well, that's very questioner, because see, what you're saying is my own inner expectation I always respect it. And that's questioner, because it's that respect for the inner expectation. So let me make a prediction about you and your girlfriend, since your girlfriend was an obliger. One thing that you very typically see as an element of conflict with an obliger and a questioner is the obliger says to the questioner, hey, let's exercise together. Hey, why don't you ask me if I exercise? Keep an eye on me and make sure that I'm not snacking. Like, and then the questioner is like, I don't want to be your babysitter. If it's important to you, do it. If it's not important to you, don't do it. I don't understand why you keep talking about it and not following through. This could be a real element because questioners meet inner expectations, but obligers have a lot of challenge with inner expectations. Was that an issue for you and your girlfriend? Did that ever come up?
I could see elements of that. I think the bigger thing was Obliger rebellion, which I read about in your book.
Oh, let's talk about Obliger rebellion. So Obliger rebellion is a very common, once you know about it, it's very common. I would love to hear what form your girlfriends took. But if you don't know about it, it seems very mysterious, even though it is quite common. So Obliger rebellion is obligers will meet an expectation, and then suddenly they snap and they say, this I will not do. And sometimes it's kind of small and funny, like, I'm not going to answer your emails for 2 weeks because you're pushing me too hard. But then sometimes it can be really dramatic. It can be quitting a job like that day. Like I walked into work this morning and I quit that afternoon, getting a divorce, ending a 30-year friendship. And obligers often describe it as feeling explosive and it's out of control. It's meant to be protective. It's meant to blow up a situation where the obliger feels exploited or taken advantage of or unheard or neglected. But to the other tendencies, it's often feels it can have reputational costs because to the other tendencies, they're like, well, if you didn't want to be on that committee, why did you agree to do it? Like I asked you if you wanted to do it and you said yes, so I don't understand why you're so mad at me now. But for an obliger, that's a very understandable position to be in. And there are many, like if you think of the movie, like It's a Wonderful Life, George Bailey is an obliger and he goes into full-on obliger rebellion. It's 27 dresses. She goes into, you see examples of it all the time. But to an obliger, they'll often say, I'm acting out of character. I don't understand why I'm doing this. And it's a relief to them to realize, well, this is a very common pattern. And you really want to understand it because it can be beneficial, but it can also be destructive. And sometimes it's funny, and sometimes it's not funny. What form of did your girlfriend's obliger rebellion take?
So I was in residency and I was like building some businesses on the side. So I was very busy and she was definitely total sweetheart. She was overextending herself and doing a lot more. It was long distance too. So she would visit me, come down to Southern California. And then I think it just got to the point where it was like too much because she would come down. We wouldn't be able to spend that much time having fun because I'd be in the hospital and I'd have 1 day off per week. And then I needed to catch up on, the businesses. So I think she was in Obliger rebellion when she actually suggested the book. And she's like, you know what, I'm just like feeling really frustrated. And if you read this book, I think we'd better understand each other.
There you go. Yeah, sometimes it's like somebody was saying because of COVID that the form that their obliger rebellion took against the virus. It's like, what does it even mean to like rebel against the virus? You can't. But she was saying she was refusing to wear her seatbelt. And like in her mind, it's sort of like, I'll show you. It's like, who are you showing? No one. Like, who does this hurt? No one but you, theoretically. But the thing is once a rebellion starts, it kind of has to run its course. And so for those of us who are around obligers, or if you are an obliger yourself, you really want to watch out for that growing resentment and anger and try to head it off, because once it happens, it can be quite dramatic.
So this is not quite like maybe not a defense mechanism, but like when an obliger is stressed, it's more likely to come out. Is that right?
Yeah, in a way, it is interesting. It is sort of like a defense mechanism. Yeah, it's supposed to blow up a situation that's become insupportable. So if I'm taking all the night shifts and nobody else is helping out, if I'm doing too much, if I feel like I'm making all the accommodations in a relationship and you're not making any, at a certain point, it kind of blows everything up. And so you can see why sometimes it's good, because it changes the dynamic so dramatically. Like I had an email from somebody who's like a chef, and he was at a place where they were just like working him relentlessly, and he quit, and just kind of like in a flash, he just quit. He was like, I felt great. But I was kind of shocked by the fact that I just like went in and without any planning at all, just quit. So it got him out of that situation. But you could see how maybe you want to take your time and think that through, or like have a game plan, because it's meant to help you, but because it's sort of explosive, it's out of control. And so, and sometimes interestingly, and for, like, to think about this from doctors, now this is totally unscientific. So here this is anecdata, take it for what it's worth, but I say this to people who are going into medicine because I've heard about this from a lot of people about health. Obliger rebellion in some people seems to take the form of health behaviors turned toward the self. Maybe I feel like I can't risk obliger rebellion at work, or I can't risk obliger rebellion in my relationship, and so I turn it toward myself. And so people will often say, like, I couldn't stand working and then my back went out. Or like I couldn't go to work because of migraines. It's like their bodies were like, okay, you know what? We're shutting this down right now. We're going to like take it over. Kind of unexplained maladies that sideline you. And also it can take very unhealthy behaviors. For instance, somebody who says, with a boss like mine, you expect me to watch my blood sugar? There's no way. It's like, whoa, okay. Like, what's up with that? Your blood sugar really has nothing to do with your boss. Like, this is something that you need to do for yourself, right? No, because of all the pressures that are being put on me from the outside, I have to take it out on myself. Given the hours, I spend 100 hours a week at work. You think that I have time to eat healthy? It's like, that's, you know what I mean? And it's not even just like, oh, I don't have time to deal with it. It's like this anger, it's this resentment, it's this feeling of like, I'll show you, or I'm gonna push back. It's this rebellious feeling. But it doesn't really make sense. And it often blows back on the obliger themselves in a way that's very unhealthy. And so again, you want to understand, like, if you're doing this to get back at your boss, it's not working. That's not how these things work. Let's reframe the situation and maybe change the situation for you, because this isn't effective. And often it can be very counterproductive. I mean, I've heard from many people who just, they won't manage the most obvious health behaviors in kind of this rebellious spirit.
Now, for pre-med, so like college students who are trying to go into medicine, or medical students, how can the Four Tendencies model help them in their lives?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think one of the things they're really concerned about is like doing well in school, right? So let's talk about like study habits and recommendations and things of that nature. So going through in order, upholders. So upholders tend to do really well in something like school because they're very good at meeting outer and inner expectations. Something that upholders might want to watch out for is they can become rigid. I say this as myself as an upholder. And like, it's like, I need to go to bed by 10:30 every night. And, and I can't, I get kind of like, I can't handle it when I am not on my groove. So if you're an upholder, you want to watch out for rigidity and remember yourself. I need to maintain some flexibility. It's okay if I stay up an hour late, or it's okay if I fall behind with my reading a little bit, to give yourself that flexibility. Another thing, and I heard this straight from a medical student. So a medical student who is an upholder, there's something called tightening. Where upholders have a rule that they're following, and over time it gets tighter and tighter. Often with people, like, the rules kind of loosen up over time. Like, I'm one of these crazy low carb people. Like, I really eat a very low carb diet. And when I started out, I was pretty good. Over time, I've become much, much stricter because the rules have tightened, which is fine in that case. But so this student was saying to me, well, when I started out, I didn't review my notes before class. But then I did it a couple times. And now I feel like every single time I go to class, I need to review my notes before class, even though I know that's not really the best use of my time. That's tightening. The rule is getting tighter, and it's choking her. So you want to be aware of that as an upholder. Don't get trapped by your own bureaucracy. Always go back to the inner expectations. Is this working for me? Is this what I want for myself? If you articulate that, that will be powerful.
Just to add to that, if I don't mean to interrupt.
Sure.
I noticed for myself too that I'm thinking that I'm like questioner with like a secondary upholder. I would get too rigid with like, okay, I always need to read the whole chapter.
Yes.
When in reality, it would have been more effective for me to skip sections, skim sections, or I need to do every practice question. I need to do like, if I set out to do something, I wanted to do it every single time. And it wasn't until medical school when I was like, okay, this is not, there's a better way to do this. And then I tried experimenting with like one block. So, pulmonology was our second block in medical school. And I tried a totally different system where I hand wrote my notes, and I hadn't done that in years. And I was trying something completely different. And then the next block after that, I was doing flashcards. And by kind of breaking free, it allowed me to actually make a lot more progress than if I just stayed rigid, like, no, this is the right way to do it. This is how it needs to be done.
Well, that is one of the great strengths of the questioner tendencies is questioners tend to be very focused on efficiency and kind of hacking systems and finding the most efficient ways. And as an upholder, and I see this with my husband and also my literary agent, who's also a questioner, that's really positive because upholders can get very rigid and kind of think like, well, I have to do everything 100%, even though that doesn't make sense. Questioners are better able to sort of say like, wait, why are we doing this? Or is this the best way? Or is this a good use of my time? And that's something we should all do. And so if you are an upholder, really articulate that for yourself and remember that that's something that you might overlook. Like, and you really want to make sure that you aren't wasting your time by like doing 100% of something where it's just paperwork. Like, why are you even doing this? But for upholders and for everybody, if you articulate the inner expectation with clarity, that's always most helpful. So you really want to say to yourself, I want to learn what I need to learn as efficiently as I can learn it. And everything that helps me do that is important to me. And anything that detracts from that is something that I should let go of. And really have that in your mind, because otherwise you get kind of like caught up in like, I should be a perfect student or I should do everything 100%. It's like, no, you shouldn't. That's not how the world works, right? So questioners, so some pitfalls for questioners. Obviously, lots of great strengths for questioners. They're very efficient for all the reasons we were just talking about, efficiency, self-starters. So some questioners can fall prey to analysis paralysis. This is when their desire for perfect information can get in the way of them making decisions or moving forward. So like, I can't decide what study guide I'm going to use because I can't, this one looks good and this one looks good, but maybe there's this other one and I get lost in the research, so I can't move forward. So with a questioner, you always want to say, is it efficient for me to keep researching, or am I better off starting like exactly what you did with your blocks? Try something, see how it works out, learn from there, and then move on. Because just infinite research, we have to act in this world without perfect information usually. And so you might use guidelines, you might use deadlines, you might use limits, you might use a respected advisor. Like if this is good enough for this person who I know really knows their stuff and they did their research, I can do what they do. I don't have to re-research it. I don't have to reinvent the wheel. I can be guided by their expert opinion. Another thing that questioners can run into, and again, this comes straight from my conversations with medical students, is they can really struggle with doing things that they think are a waste of their time. And sadly in school, a lot of times you have to do things that you think like, this isn't really doing anybody any good. It's just wasting my time. And so somebody pulled me after I gave a presentation. It's like, what do? I have this professor. I really need to get a good recommendation from this professor because it matters for my match or my specialty or whatever. I can't remember. But he's making these assignments that are just so dumb. I can't make myself do them. They waste my time. If that is a questioner, or you're smiling, maybe this rings true for you. So what you want to do if you're a questioner is you want to go to the second order of reason, right? So the first order of reason is I'm doing this assignment to teach me something. We would like to think that everything meets that first order of reason, but sometimes it doesn't. Okay, then you go to the second order of reason. The second order of reason is I want to have this professor's approval and respect. I'm not doing this assignment because I think I'm going to learn from it. I acknowledge that it's dumb, but I am doing it because I need to get a good recommendation from this professor, and this is what it takes. So I'm going to do it for that reason, not this initial reason. And that is enough to get me going. So again, I remember talking to like somebody who in high school hadn't wanted to study for the SAT. The essay is stupid. It's not a good measurement of your success and your intellect, blah, blah, blah. But it's like, but, I wanted to get a scholarship. And to get a scholarship, I had to get a certain score. So I'm not doing it because I think that there's any good reason for it, but I'm doing it because I need to get that scholarship. I went to the second order of reason. So that can often help questioners who are sort of stalling out, just kind of like because they're theoretically so annoyed by their time being wasted.
Which makes sense. And I think with questioners, going to that second order question puts things in perspective. So even with, you were talking about driving, right? Driving rules. I love cars. I take my car to the track. I like pushing it, and I like taking off traction control, testing the limits, oversteer, understeer. But when I'm driving on the roads, every driver makes mistakes. I don't think that I'm like the best driver in the world, far from it. But if I thought just, okay, I'm a good enough driver, I can handle this, I can go a little bit faster than 45 miles an hour in this section, it's fine. then that's me focusing on the first order. But if I say, okay, what happens if I do go 60 over here instead? And I think about getting a ticket or what it's going to do to my insurance premium, et cetera. Then I'm like, okay, hold up. This puts things in perspective. I'll just drive 45 or 50.
That's a perfect example. You're not doing it because of the first reason. You're doing it because of the second reason. So absolutely. Another thing I would say of questioners, and maybe you experience this, is questioners can sometimes to other people come across as disrespectful or combative or like bottlenecks, because they're like, but why? But why? Why are we doing it this way? Why are we doing it by Friday? Why are you signing this textbook? Why, and so if you get like a thin-skinned boss or professor, they're like, your questions show that why are you questioning my judgment? Why are you undermining my authority? I want to have a team player here. You don't seem like a team player. Now, this isn't fair to the questioner, because questioners really are just like, I just want to know why. Like, you're assigning this textbook. Why? I would just like to know why. They don't mean that as in a disrespectful way. And once they have a good answer to that, they get right on board. But a questioner needs to learn how to ask questions in a constructive way, because it can come across as very kind of impudent or combative. And sometimes people will say like, oh, this questioner makes me feel like I'm on the witness stand. Like, because of all these questioning. And a very common thing for questioners is to be told, you ask too many questions. If you're getting that, I understand that from the questioner's perspective, like, it makes good sense. And they're actually helping the team. They're helping other students by making sure that we're all not, why would we all waste our time? Like, let's get answers to these questions. I get it. But in this world, it's much more effective to learn to ask in a way like, I'm so interested that you chose this textbook. There's so many on the market. Like, I would love to know why you think this is the best one, because I think that's really helpful information. Like, why do you think that this expert is the one that we should all learn from? Or why is this, because it's fine to want to understand, but you just want to make sure that you don't fall into that thing where people start feeling like you're attacking me, you're undermining me. I don't like this.
Which is probably very useful, especially in like student groups. For a lot of students need to work in group projects,
Yes.
and you may have one person that seems difficult, but maybe they need to calibrate their questions, and it's likely that they're probably a questioner in that case.
Absolutely. And I think this is a good example of what you were saying at the very beginning, understanding yourself and kind of how other people are relating to you. A lot of times, not by denying yourself, but just by kind of changing the way that you're presenting things, you can make other people feel a lot more comfortable and get where you want with a lot more efficiency. Because something like, well, I don't understand why you formatted it this way. Like, that makes me feel defensive, even if you don't mean it in a kind of an undermining way. You're just like, why would you use that way? Like, that's not how I imagined it. But if you're like, oh, that's so interesting that you did it this way, like, take us through the logic of this, because in my mind, I pictured it totally differently. Then I'm like, oh, cool. I'm imaginative and creative, and I came up with something unexpected, instead of feeling like, oh my gosh, you're making me feel like an idiot in front of 5 other people I hardly know. So, right. So it's all about just like thinking about how you're coming across and realizing how that can seem to other people.
Well said.
So then obligers. So the thing for obligers to remember, and this is like the giant takeaway from obligers, is if there's an inner expectation that you want to meet, you must have outer accountability. If you want to exercise more, do not think about self-care. Do not think about putting yourself first. Don't think about your priorities. Don't think about motivation. Think about, am I going to exercise with a friend who's going to be annoyed if I don't show up? Am I going to pay for a class where the instructor is going to know if I don't come? Am I going to take my dog for a run who's going to be so disappointed if he doesn't get to go for his run? Plus, he's probably going to tear up the furniture. Am I going to raise money for a charity that's not going to make that charity if I don't do that run? Am I going to think of my duty to be a role model for other people? Do I think about how I have to take care of myself if I'm going to care for others? Do I want to think about my duty to my future self? Do I want to sign up for an app? Do I want to like join a group? Like, there's a million ways to create outer accountability once you realize that is what you need. And a lot of times obligers are like, kind of like, they think it's weak that they need outer accountability. I'm like, this is a huge group of people in the world. It's the biggest group. So many people need outer accountability. Just get it. Just get yourself outer accountability, and then you can do anything you want. It's not hard once you realize that that's what you need. Whereas a lot of times obligers waste a lot of time trying to like work themselves up into a frenzy of completion. It's like, don't worry, don't do that. It doesn't work, and it's exhausting. Just get outer accountability.
Awesome. And for rebel students?
Right. Well, and I should say for obligers, probably school works well because there's deadlines, there's all kinds of deliverables. That tends to work well for obligers. Often obligers struggle then when they're outside of a system like that, where it's like, or like maybe I was in a team sport in college, and so I got all the exercise I need. But now that I'm in medical school and I'm not on a team sport, like how am I going to replicate that? Because I do really well with my schoolwork because I have a professor looking over me, but I don't have it for other parts of my life.
Okay, so then maybe they start overemphasizing studying because they don't have that structure for exercise. Then they're like, oh my God, I'm spending all this time studying, and now obviously we know that exercise is very important for mental health, for
Yes.
balance, etc. And then in that case, what would you recommend? Like they have a friend, like a workout buddy?
I mean, there's a million ways to create outer accountability. I mean, it just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds because so many people need outer accountability. So it's whatever works for you. But also you have to be flexible because what works for some obligers might not work for others. So for instance, like work out with a buddy or take a class, that works well. But I also have obligers who say to me, but I'm really introverted. And the idea of taking a class just is such a turnoff for me. Well, then there's other ways, like get an app where you check in every day. And you get an auto reminder, or I mean, there's so many variety. I mean, and obligers are so ingenious in what they come up with. So here's just like my favorite example. For some reason, a thing that I've heard from a lot of obligers about is they want to wake up on time, right? And yet they are completely seduced by the snooze alarm, and then they keep sleeping in, even though they don't want to. They're not getting up. So if you live by yourself, how do you create outer accountability for getting up on time, right? That seems like, how would you do that? So I heard from one obliger who made a very embarrassing post on Facebook and set it and used Hootsuite, which is a social media management platform, to have it automatically post every day at 8 a.m. unless she got up to disable it. So she had to get up because otherwise this Facebook post would go up. So that got her out of bed. And then another guy, he lived by himself, but he had a dog, Ginger. So on his phone, he changed his alarm to be, Ginger, do you want to go for a walk? Ginger, do you want to go for a walk? And so his dog would like spring to her feet, jump on the bed and be like, yes, man, I am ready when you are. And then he's like, he can't sleep because he's got his golden retriever, like, breathing in his face. So it's outer accountability, but it's clever. So there's all different kinds of ways to create outer accountability. For some people, spend money. If I spend money on something, I'm not going to waste my money. Other obligers, it's almost like that makes them feel like they're off the hook. Like, well, I paid for it. So it's pretty much like I did that exercise class. So you want to pay attention to what makes you feel. Some people can be can be obliged to their future selves. For other people, that doesn't matter at all. It's always good to look at the past. When you, like my friend who was on the track team, there was a clue there because at that time she did do it. So maybe she wants to try to replicate that in her life now. So always, if you're struggling in the present, think back, well, was there a time when I was doing this well? And what might I learn from that experience? Like if I was cooking all the time when I lived in that group house in Washington, D.C., why am I not cooking now? Well, like a friend of mine was saying, she realized that when she lived in her group house in D.C., somebody else was buying the groceries. She hates going to the grocery store. It wasn't actually the cooking that was interfering with her healthy eating. She liked to cook. She would like to grocery shop. Well, that's a very different problem to solve. It's like, okay, I'll have, Fresh Direct deliver my food. Now I don't have to grocery shop. So now I am eating healthier because I didn't understand why I wasn't doing it. So always look back in the past. So for obligers, it's always that outer accountability. And then for rebels. So rebels, you really have to get yourself into another mental space. And I feel like rebels are the most misunderstood tendency. They're the most different from the other three tendencies. And that's too bad because they really are coming from a very different place from the other three tendencies. And once you understand that, it's much easier to understand yourself as a rebel, and it's much easier to deal with other rebels because a lot of the things that would work with the other three tendencies either don't work or are actually counterproductive for rebels. Rebels are good at doing what they want to do for their own reasons, in their own way, in their own time. They can do anything they want to do. They often love to meet a challenge. They love to, you say I can't go through medical school without having a drop of alcohol, watch me. Like, somebody was saying how they had tried to get their husband to quit smoking for decades and wouldn't do it. And then finally their 18-year-old son was like, man, I don't even know why you talk about quitting smoking anymore. An old guy like you could never quit smoking. And the guy's like, watch me.
Challenge accepted.
So there's that. But so if you are a rebel and you're trying to get yourself to do something, or you're trying to get a rebel to do something, there's sort of two things to keep in mind, two avenues. One is identity. For rebels, identity is of a supreme importance. They want to put their identity out into the world. And so to think about the identity is very powerful. So I'm not exercising because my doctor tells me to. I'm not exercising because my sweetheart tells me to. I'm not exercising because I said I would. I'm not exercising because I signed up for that class. I'm exercising because I'm an athlete. I've always been an athlete. And I kind of got away from that for a few years, but now I'm getting back into it because I love to use my body. That's who I am. Or it's like, I'm a person who heals other people. I go through the world and I see an opportunity to do good. I love restoring people's vitality and health. That is who I am. I'm going to do what I need to do to put that out into the world. Not because you're telling me to, because that's who I am. And so the more that rebels can tie to their identity, or you can help them see how something ties to their identity, this is what you want. This is what you choose. That's going to help them. Another thing completely different is information consequences choice. You tell the rebel, you give them the information they need. You tell them the consequences of their action or their inaction, and then you let them decide. So you could say, hey man, you just had this operation, and I'm here to tell you, we see two very different outcomes here. There are people who do their physical therapy and they get great outcomes. They're pain-free, they get off medication, they're independent, they're getting dressed by themselves, they're showering by themselves, they're traveling, they're getting on planes and buses, they're doing whatever they want. Great outcome. And then we see people who don't do their follow-up physical therapy, and we see a very different result. They're on pain medication. They are not able to move very easily. Maybe they're dependent on a cane or a wheelchair or a walker. They need a lot of help at home, like doing their daily life. They're just not feeling great. So here's some pamphlets, and I'm here to answer any questions you have. It's like, okay, man, it's up to you, because what outcome do you want? Because because here's the thing that to remember with rebels, the more I insist, the more I nag, the more I remind, the more I might ignite the spirit of resistance. And even something like, if I said to you, oh, it's so great you're finally following doctor's orders, that rebel might be like, you think I'm doing that because the doctor is telling me to? Well, now I'm going to stop. If you have a rebel, you want to be very, very careful about igniting that spirit of resistance, because for some rebels, even if they want to do something, they will not do it if somebody tells them to do it, because they will not accept somebody even thinking that they're telling them what to do. That spirit of independence is so strong. And so a lot of times with the rebel, the best thing to do is nothing. It's to say nothing, make sure they have the information they need, because so they can make an informed decision. But you sort of have to let them play it out. A lot of times you have to let negative consequences fall. And that's hard. It's painful to see that happen.
Between rebels and questioners, what you're saying is like, give them the information and then let them decide. What's the difference? Is the difference that with a questioner you can suggest, you can give them the information and prescribe one as being superior, and with a rebel you don't want to do that, but you still give them the information?
If you want to know the difference between how to tell a questioner from a rebel, here's how you tell. I tell you to do something. Is your response, why should I? Or is your response, you can't make me? The rebel is resisting control. The questioner is asking why they would do it. So you're absolutely right. For a questioner to say, this is what would work. But here's the thing about questioners. They often love to customize. This comes up in health a lot, in health regimens. They like to customize. They like to adapt things for themselves. And so if something's important for them not to adapt it, you've got to explain to them, because they will often just adapt something. So for instance, if I said to you, okay, so I want you to go for a 20-minute walk every morning and then take this pill before breakfast. There's no reason there, right? You might think, oh, I gave you all kinds of reasons. This is what I'm telling you to do, right? I'm the doctor. All of that is totally arbitrary. Why 20 minutes? Why a walk, not a run? Why in the morning? Why take it before breakfast? You haven't told me why I should do anything. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to swim for an hour, and then I'm going to take my pill before bed, because that's when I take all my other pills, and that's more efficient. So you need to say to me, you need to take this pill before breakfast because it will interfere with your sleep cycle. You need to take this with a meal because otherwise you're going to get nauseated. I am telling you 20 minutes. That is the minimum. Feel free to do more if that's what you want. I'm telling you to walk, blah, 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 blah. Why? Then you can take it from there. So if that is a kind of suggestion, like I'm telling you what is important, and then I'm going to let you figure out how that works for you, but I'm going to give you all the information. But so with a rebel, it's much more like drop mic. It's much more like, here's the situation, and now it's over to you. And that's hard. It's hard for people not to interfere. It's hard not to remind. It's hard to watch while people delay. But often, if you are trying to nudge someone along, you are actually contributing to delay. Now, nobody wants to do things that are arbitrary. Nobody wants to do things that are like nonsensical or make no sense or waste time or seem like unfounded in reason. We all want to know why. But it's sort of like, how does that figure into your action? For an obliger, one thing a questioner often does with an obliger is they're like, I see that you're not doing something. So I'm going to tell you why you should. And I'm going to send you another study. And I'm going to send you another study. Then I'm going to send you this link. Then I'm going to send you this interview. Why? Because the more you're convinced, the more your action will change. Works for a questioner. For an obliger, no, they need outer accountability. And for a rebel, you don't want to swamp them with information. You just want to this is what you need to know. What do you want? Because you're in control. This is up to you. It's whatever you choose. But there's consequences to everything. So what's the consequences?
So rebels are the least common. Is that right? Have you seen this manifest with students? I know you've spent some time with medical students.
No, it comes up all the time. And I think it's really helpful to know your own and other people's. Like, I thought your study group example was perfect, because you could see how one person would feel like, I'm a really valuable member of the group. And everybody else in the group is like, oh my gosh, that person is a super big pain. And so you want to understand that. And again, like with an obliger, if you are an obliger, you're dealing with an obliger, you want to make sure that you do have that outer accountability. So it's not like, when you have some time, why don't you get around to that? That's not really accountability, right? Like, maybe I need more of a deadline. Maybe I am going to work with a partner, because then I'm going to feel like I'm accountable. I mean, one thing that a lot of obligers have been saying under Safer at Home is there are, again, because there's so many obligers, there's all these kind of apps and devices and things, tools for them. And I forget the name of this one, but it's like you basically just sign up with a stranger who's like, I want to work from 2 to 4 today, and I need to know that I need to have somebody's eyes on me. And so you and I both sign up, and I'm working on my thing, you're working on your thing. We're not even talking, but I have that. It's like being in the library, right? Where you have all the people working around you, or, you're working with your roommates, and you're like, okay, well, they're working, so I've got to be working, because that's what's happening right now. So it's creating that kind of outer accountability. Yeah. And then I think that the tightening thing that you were talking about, very common, where it's like, I'm spending too much time to kind of be so thorough, even though thoroughness doesn't even really serve me. And then with a rebel, it's always to remember, what do you want? Always stay very focused on what you want. Don't listen to what other people are telling you to do. Maybe they want you to do what you're doing. Maybe they don't. Don't let that distract you from what you want for yourself. That is always the North Star for a rebel. And to remember, like, I'm doing this because this is what I want. This is going to get me where I want to go. I remember, this is perhaps analogous to being in medical school. I was talking to a guy, I won't name the company, but let's just say it's a very, very well-known company that is also very well-known for how tightly controlling it is of its own people. And I said to him, how does a rebel like you work in a place like this? Because it's very controlling. And he said, they're working for me because I want to leave and have my own startup. And so I am just sucking up all the information. I am learning everything and making a great salary. And then I'm going to go out and I'm going to start my own thing. And they've trained me. So it's like, you're working for me. That can often work for rebels. Like, you think I'm working for you, but actually you're working for me. Hey, professor, you think I'm handing in the assignment for you, but actually you're teaching me everything I want to know, because I'm going to blow away the world with what I can do. You're working for me. And that can often help rebels too, because it has that feeling of independence and control that they seek.
A common theme I'm seeing is that the perspective you have, how you frame something, is possibly even more important than what's actually happening.
Oh, right. This is the great insight of the world, right? It seems like it could not be true. It is so true. Our understanding of what's happening is so crucial. You think reality, like, you think, well, something is just happening. No, it's not. It's not. And different people, and this is, I think, a key thing to understand with the tendencies, because you might think that you're giving a very straightforward message, but you're not, because different people are going to hear it in different ways. And the best way to look at this is to go to a shared kitchen, like an office kitchen or a dorm room kitchen, and read the signs, because you'll see all the tendencies, like just the idea of like, let's all put our mugs in the dishwasher when they're dirty. It's like, this will incite massive debate, right? Because people have a really different response to just that very simple idea. Is that a good use of my time? Is that a bad use of my time? Why am I doing this? Why are you telling me I'm not going to do it? Why are we having this conversation? You know, here's a great example. So when you're trying to communicate with other people, it can be challenging, because each of the four tendencies, like you say, kind of lives in their own universe and has their own responses. And there is a public service announcement from decades ago. It hasn't been used widely in years, probably like in the lifetime of most medical students. And yet everyone knows it because it's so powerful and it's so effective. And I think the reason that it's so powerful is that it's very short, and yet it speaks directly to each of the four tendencies. And the message is, only you can prevent forest fires. It goes to upholder, it goes to questioner, it goes to obliger, and it goes to rebel. That's not easy to do, to have something so powerful and so succinct. But you have to think about it, because what you're saying to somebody might come across very differently depending on how they're, like how it fits into their own nature. And we know this intellectually, but it's surprising sometimes when you see it play out.
Absolutely. So if you understand your tendency, it's a lot easier to then motivate yourself and also understand how you come off to other people and how other people can respond to you. From my experience, it seems like kind of practices or strategies that may be better for the complete opposite, obliger, for example, can still be useful for me. So maybe I should still experiment. Like I do cycling. I'm here in Vegas, and it's like 110 degrees during the day, and I need to cycle at 5 a.m. or 6 a.m. Otherwise, it's too hot. And when I have my friend, like the night before, we agree we're going to meet, at the trail at whatever time, I will be there. But when I try going by myself, oftentimes I wake up, I'm like, you know what? I'll just do the indoor trainer today. It's not a big deal.
Right. No, you're exactly right. A lot of times tools can be useful to all of us, and you might pick and choose. So it's not that like one thing works for one. It's sort of like, if you don't know where to start here and then experiment from there. Also, if you find that something really doesn't work for you, instead of like trying to instead of saying, well, something's wrong with me. For instance, rebels often can't use to-do lists, right? And I've had rebels say to me, I just felt like I wasn't a real grown-up. Like, what's wrong with me? Everybody in the world uses to-do lists. And I'm like, not rebels. Some do, some don't. Some use a things I could do delay list, a might could list, a things I feel like doing today list. They gamify it in all different ways. It's like, that's not a tool that works for them. Also for rebels, like accountability doesn't work for them. I don't need accountability. Now, here's the thing. Questioners and upholders often don't need accountability. I like it sometimes, just like you like it with your friend. But often people try to get you into these elaborate systems of accountability that are really just a waste of time if you don't need it. And so I'm like, why would I track my carbs? I mean, I just eat low carb. I don't need that. Somebody else might need it. And so it's a good use of their time. Like and this could go to tightening as well. Because like I had a friend who's an upholder, and his girlfriend was having super good luck with a budgeting app where you like would record all your expenses, and she loved it. And she was trying to get him to use it. And he said very wisely, I shouldn't use that, because I would get so preoccupied with like entering in every single penny that I spent that it would kind of swamp me. It's not a good use of my time because I don't have a problem with spending now. And it would really be a misdirection of my energy. So for her, it was a really helpful tool, but for him, it wouldn't have been a helpful tool. But he realized that. And so you just want to always think about, well, this is a good tool for some people. Does this sound like the kind of thing that would appeal to me or that would be useful to me? Or is it something that I don't really need, or it doesn't really appeal to me? Because there's a million tools, but I think sometimes like an expert says, there's one best way. What you need to do is decide what your 3 priorities for the day are, write them down, and then get up at 7 a.m. in the morning and do the first 3 before 9 a.m. And that's what all the most successful people do. That's just not true. That is 100% not true. Maybe you're a morning person, maybe you're a night person, maybe you're a rebel who doesn't like to make to-do lists. I mean, there's no one right way. There's no magic one-size-fits-all solution. And what happens is sometimes people feel like there's something wrong with them. And so they feel very depressed and dejected, and they fail over and over. Not because there's something wrong with them, but because they're just trying the wrong tool. So if a tool isn't working, and as a questioner, I'm sure this is like exactly your philosophy. If it's not working, move on. Try something else. There's a million ways to do it. Try something different. And when you're trying something different, the tendencies could often point you in the right direction. So you're not just throwing spaghetti against the wall and just trying like, oh, my brother-in-law did this. Oh, my roommate did this. Oh, my professor says this is what works for her. Yeah, it's like, well, I'm an obliger. Let me start with an accountability, because that's what's probably going to work. There's a million ways to have accountability, but the key thing is, do I have that outer accountability? So it can make it a lot more efficient and less frustrating. And also you don't have that kind of self-accusation that many people are discouraged. They don't understand why, or they'll say something like, I don't understand why, like, I can meet every assignment that I get in class, and yet I can't exercise. It's like, and that seems like a total mystery to them. I'm like, that's no mystery. That's totally obvious. So now we know how to solve that. So it's just less frustrating.
So what if someone takes the quiz and they don't agree with their result?
Well, I think, as I said, like, you can always a quiz is tricky. And oh my gosh, I've worked on that quiz so much to try to get it to a place where like a lot of people could take it and almost always get the right answer. But sometimes what happens is people will over concentrate on like one area in their life and they'll answer all. And that's not a good way. You want to do more like what's your general attitude, because there's always like weird particular idiosyncratic things that can happen like in a certain area. Like you have some like weird thing about exercise for whatever historical reason in your life. So that can happen. But if you feel really strongly that the quiz got you wrong, then I think that's helpful too, because sometimes by knowing what you're not and being like, actually, this other thing really rings more true. That's another way to get to the answer. It's about that clarity. And I do think that sometimes when people answer it, they do answer the way they wish they felt instead of the way maybe they really do feel. Like they might say like, yeah, I would do that. Like, how do you feel about New Year's resolutions? I think New Year's resolutions are a great idea. But have you ever successfully kept a New Year's resolution? You're like, this year I'm so committed to New Year's resolutions this year. How'd that go before? Have you succeeded in the past? Yeah. So sometimes the aspiration can kind of get in the way. But yeah, I would always trust your own judgment and the people around you. I mean, it's funny when I talk to work groups where people know each other well, often when I'm presenting, like people will start laughing and they'll all start pointing because it's like, it's so obvious to them what somebody's tendency is, because they're like, oh yeah, we work with this guy. He's a questioner. Like they know. If everybody around you is like, it's clear, it's like, they probably have, it's probably worth thinking about.
The New Year's resolution example, I think you wrote that in the book too. I remember reading that and being like, oh, this totally makes sense, because if you're the kind of person that thinks it's just arbitrary to have a single day in the year versus just starting a new habit. Like I did a plant-based diet for around 5 years, and I started it the Monday before Thanksgiving, because like I was just having conversations with people. I had, et cetera. Like it just made sense. So I was like, okay, I'm gonna start now. And people are like, oh, why don't you just wait until after Thanksgiving?
Yeah.
How does it matter?
Exactly. Yeah. Whereas, the arbitrariness of January 1st really bothers questioners. It's funny. And like everybody else is like, they might do it or not, but they're like, the January 1stness of it all doesn't really get in their way the way it does with questioners. Yeah. No, New Year's resolutions, I always ask people about New Year's resolutions because there's a lot of information there, because also obligers they will often say they've stopped making New Year's resolutions because they've tried and failed in the past. And rebels often either love a New Year's resolution because it's a huge challenge, like, I decided this was the year I was going to run the marathon, or they refuse to do them at all because they don't want to chain themselves. And that's probably more common. Like they don't like to have this idea of like committing themselves to a resolution. It just doesn't, like the whole undertaking doesn't appeal to them. They're kind of like, oh, I would never do something like that.
So I want to be respectful of your time. Just a couple more questions. If you can think back to when you were a student.
I was a law student.
So, and you're an upholder for your entire life, because that doesn't change.
Yeah.
Were there any things that now, knowing what you know now, you would have done differently back then as a student, as a law student?
I think that one thing that I would have done much more is to think about, well, what do I want? Because the thing about upholders is they're really good at execution. And so if you say, this is what you should do, they'll be like, I can do that. And that's a great thing. Being an upholder is one of my favorite things about myself. There's many strengths to that. And upholders can also meet inner expectations, but those inner expectations have to be articulated clearly. And I feel like I was pretty far along in my life before I started saying, well, what is really my inner expectation for myself? And once I did, I was able to make that switch. But I think for a long time, I was just like content to just be meeting outer expectations. And in the end, that's not a good way to create a happy life, because we can only build a happy life on the foundation of our own nature, our own values, our own interests, our own nature. And so I wish that I'd really disciplined myself much more to think about, what do I want? Now I would do things like, I need a break, I need a rest, I need to exercise. I was good about kind of taking care of myself, kind of inner expectations, but not really things like, what interests me? What do I like to do? It was more like, if this needs to get done, I'll get it done. I need to become an expert on ERISA. That's what I will do. Instead of being like, why are you doing this anyway? One of the reasons I'm glad to be married to a questioner, because he's just like, why are you doing that? I'm like, that's a good question. Why am I doing this? He saves me a lot of energy.
In that initial video I made summarizing the Four Tendencies Model and applying to students,
which I loved. I thought it was amazing.
Thank you. One of the, a lot of people that watch my videos are I think a lot of them are questioners. My assumption is that a lot of scientifically minded people are more likely to be questioners. Is that fair to say?
Well, that's a very interesting question, and I would love to have the big data to see what the correlation is. Now, what I would say is that all of the tendencies can do basically all of the professions in their own way, because you could say, like, I have a friend who is incredibly analytical, incredibly brilliant mathematically. She's a doctor and she's an obliger, right? So it's not like they go together. It's not like a scientist has to be a questioner, or people will say, I'm a journalist, so of course I'm a questioner because my job is to ask questions. So I don't think it's necessary, but I do think that sometimes you're drawn to something because it suits your tendency, and also it rewards those strengths in you. So, if you're a questioner and you go into a scientific field, your questioning is probably very rewarded. Whereas if you were a questioner and you were going into a field where it's like, we're a team and we have a visionary leader, we're here to do what the leader wants, you can be like, okay, I'm not going to do well in this environment. It's like, it's a great environment for the different kind of person, not going to suit a questioner. So I think there is like kind of push and pull between your natural kind of intellectual interest and then also how you might be well suited to something, or you might like pick the area. But, like a doctor, somebody said to me, well, I'm sure all doctors are questioners. No, there are upholder doctors, there are questioner doctors, there are obliger doctors, there are rebel doctors. And you can imagine how each one of them would bring their own flavor to it. That being said, I do think that anything related to research is probably particularly satisfying to questioners. Ooh, but here's an important thing to remember. Questioners can often be crackpots. This comes up with doctors. They meet a crackpot, right? It's like, hey, doctor, I did my own research. I have a friend who did his own research online about his cancer treatment, came up with his own conclusions and refused to do what the doctor suggested and the whole team suggested because he'd come up with his own ideas. Now, I mentioned Steve Jobs earlier, very famous, right? Steve Jobs had his own very specific ideas about what he should do for his health. And he wasn't convinced by other people's arguments because he felt very confident in his own judgment. And I think people who believe in conspiracy theories and things like that probably are often questioners because they're like, I'm looking at the information and I'm making my own judgment. I see what others don't see. I'm putting things together in my own way. And I'm the best judge, right? So it can look that way too. So it's not, there's a lot, every positive kind of has its negative or its dark side.
So the reason I bring that up is a lot of people, maybe I shouldn't say a lot, a handful of people, a few people responded to the kind of idea, and they're like, oh, what's like the scientific basis or the backing for the Four Tendency Model? And I mean, I have thoughts about this. I actually don't think it necessarily needs to be scientifically validated for it to offer value, right? If I wake up in the morning and I notice I'm more productive in the morning, I don't need to find research to prove that I feel more productive in the mornings.
I like that phrase. I totally agree with you. And I love that phrasing. Something doesn't have to be validated to have value. That's very elegantly put. I'm writing that down. I completely agree. To me, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. And if this is a framework that works for you, that kind of unlocks something for you, and I've seen over and over, people are like, oh my gosh, this is like the key that explains my whole history. And like now I'm able to do something successfully that I have never been able to do my whole life. It's really working. That said, I am working with somebody at the University of Michigan who's going to try to like create like scientific scales and test it and do all that, because I think, first of all, I'd just be very interested in it. And I think a lot of people would be more likely to use it if they felt like they had that research behind it. When I talk about the, I know questioners are very concerned with selection bias because they know I have this quiz online, like 2.8 million people have taken the quiz. And when I talk about the proportions of the tendencies, they're very concerned with selection bias. I assure you, I'm aware of selection bias. And so I paid for a representative sample to take the quiz so that I could see the percentages of each of the four. And I will say it does comport with what I see in the world, which is there's a lot of obligers in the world. Like, just look around. There's a lot of obligers. Rebels, conspicuous, not that many rebels. Like you can feel it in the world, but that's also, but I did test that with a survey. But in terms of the scientific basis for it, we've kind of got that underway. I agree though. I'm like, if it's useful, that's the best test. You know, it's like just data point of one. If it somehow, you know, I feel like I'm more like Samuel Johnson or Montaigne than I am like, you know, the people who created, you know, I don't know, the big five.
Yeah, I've tried all these different personality tests just to get better understanding of me, and you know, each one has taught me something a little bit different.
Okay, but so here's the thing about a lot of those tests, and I will say this, and of course this is in my vanity, I think my test is better in this way, is a lot of those tests are trying to create a picture of your, like a whole person. And so you're like, well, this is kind of true, but this isn't kind of true. And so it's sort of like, it doesn't really work. Or there's things that aren't explained, like, okay, big five, conscientiousness. This is one of the things that really puzzled me for years because I'm 100% conscientious, right? I'm 5 or 10, I forget what the scale is for the big five. I'm really conscientious. And I get people who aren't conscientious too. But what are the people that are patchy conscientious, that are like halfway conscientious? How do you explain that? They don't explain that. They don't explain why would somebody be conscientious in some circumstances and not in others. This was something that like haunted me for years, and the tendencies explain that because it has to do with the accountability and the expectations. And so I think sometimes the personality frameworks, they're too broad, and so some things resonate, some things don't. You're kind of left with a mishmash, or there's just too many. There's one, what was it, one that has like 64 categories. I'm like, okay, that's just not useful, right? Like the mind can't hold that much nuance. I like the, again, it's like, it's not that, these are very obvious once you don't, like Game of Thrones. I will sit here right now and I will go through all the major characters of Game of Thrones and tell you their tendencies. Because it's not subtle. Like you don't, you know, it's right out there. So I'm more puzzled by the fact that no one's noticed this before. I kept thinking like, okay, this is like a major established test that I just don't know about. I don't think so.
So on your website, you also have this new course. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
So people kept saying to me, I want to know more, I want to know more. So the course is an online course. It's a video course where you can really go deeper into the 4 tendencies. And it's aimed at if you want to know yourself, and also if you want to know other people, because I think we want to know ourselves, but then a lot of times it's like understanding how to deal with other people with more efficiency and less conflict. And so it talks about that. It talks about it in a lot of different specific contexts, whether it's like at work or like in a school. Healthcare comes up a lot, romantic relationships, and self-management. Like I want to eat a plant-based diet. I want to exercise. I want to get back into meditation. Like, how do I succeed at that? And so it goes through all 4. And what surprised me is that it turns out that what a lot of people's favorite aspect of the course is that I have a lot of interviews with people of the tendencies talking about their own experiences with the tendencies. And this has proved to be extremely useful to people because once you know your tendency, hearing from somebody, and these are all people who are very successful and like really doing really great things, tapping into the strength of their tendency. So talking about kind of their pitfalls and their safeguards and like kind of the fixes that they've had and how they've made use of their tendency, that's turned out to be very valuable for people as well.
Awesome. And for those of you who are interested, you can find the course at GretchenRubin.com. You can also use this coupon code that I'm showing across the screen for 50% off through July. And you can also use the link down in the description. Gretchen, it has truly been a pleasure. Anything else you wanna tell the viewers?
No, it was so fun to talk to you. I love the video that you made. It was so much fun to see my ideas come to life with somebody else's handiwork.
I really appreciate that, and I found the Four Tendencies so helpful when I was in residency and navigating different personalities. So
Yeah, I bet. Yes, it's
yeah,
intense.
yeah, this was so much fun. Thanks again, and again, everyone, you can find the links down in the description. And yeah, we'll see you later.
Thank you.